Okay, so our frost conditions of concern, oftentimes it's spring frost. Like in this example, this is a fairly late frost. The vines had already made very substantial growth and then get hit with a frost. So we'll kind of talk about some of the implications for that. Oftentimes this is more the typical example where you can see the little brown frosted shoot here that was probably several weeks old when it got hit by frost. And there was a question earlier about the grapevine bud and how the compound bud and how the shoots grow from that bud. This is an example of that primary bud position getting killed off by the frost, and then that bud responds by sending out secondary and tertiary shoots from that same position. So that is part of its response. It evolved to adapt to these situations of losing growth, but that does not occur without some impact to the vine. The other situation are fall frosts like this. Definitely there are areas where exposed to this type of cold, where if you lose the entire canopy due to frost prior to harvest, that is going to have some impact on that vine. Once you lose the leaves, you're not photosynthesizing, you're not making more sugars to put into that fruit. You lose the protection, the shade protection of that fruit. Now it's fully exposed, whether it be to sun, rain, whatever else may be. So it's usually people like to get that fruit off very quickly after being frosted like this. Okay, then impacts on vines from being frosted. Well, there's a delay from having to regrow and recreate, if we're talking about spring frost here. Oftentimes, that regrowth has a lower crop level than the original primary shoot would have provided, so less crop. A mixed maturity, so if frost only affects a portion of the block, now you have basically two different maturity levels you're trying to farm. Or if frost affects a portion of the vines, now you have different, that's not a product placement, I promise here. If a frost affects a portion of the vine, let's say the upper part but not the lower part, now you have mixed maturities, basically new shoots forming as well as older shoots which are going to continue at the original pace. That can be a big challenge to farm. Reduced carbohydrate storage. If you have early growth, which is then killed off by a frost, well, to produce that early growth, the vine had to mobilize storage carbohydrates to create that growth. Having to recreate it comes at an additional cost to the vine to have to remobilize additional storage carbohydrates to recreate new growth. So that can have implications for later in the year going into dormancy, not having as much carbohydrate storage as it may have had otherwise. So it can have longer term impacts on winter hardiness and then growth even the following season. So with frost protection, we have basically two different types, either what we call passive frost protection. These are things done well before a frost event, and we're basically trying to create an environment where frost is less risky or less severe if it happens. Or active measures where we usually right before or during the frost event, we are taking some action to try to reduce the severity. So those are the two strategies. You can do both, but oftentimes, if you have an active measure, typically you're going to go out there and apply that active measure regardless. Or if you don't have an active measure, then you're simply going to rely on the passive measures. So passive frost protection, sometimes it's to understand frost, it's good to take a step way, way back and look at the planet from afar. We often forget that we are surrounded by a very large amount of outer space which is very, very cold, and that's part of what creates frosts for us. What happens during the daytime when we're on the sunny side of the planet here, that we have energy coming in from the sun, creating the heating that we want, that we need to store. And then at nighttime, though, when we're on the dark side, here we're losing energy. This is just radiation going off to outer space. This black body radiation, outer space is very cold, so we're losing all that heat that we gained during the day. So passive frost protection, a lot of it is trying to maximize this energy that's coming in to then reduce our losses or reduce the eventual temperature that we experience due to the inevitable losses that are going to happen during the nighttime. So that is the main focus. And to try to put some numbers to those processes here, I'll show you this chart here. What this is looking at is during one single night. This is in the fall of a vineyard here. We're looking at from 6 p.m. until 6 a.m. And this sort of fuzzy gray line that's in the upper part here, that's what we call the net radiation. And that's the energy loss from the vineyard to outer space, basically. And it's negative because that's a loss. So initially, it starts off a fairly large negative value, about negative 70. Then through the night, it just gets a smaller negative value. So initially, when night falls, we have a lot of heat from the day prior, and there's a lot of rapid loss of heat. Then as the night progresses, the heat loss is reduced, but it still is occurring through the night. And that then affects temperatures. So in these lines here, there's a dashed line, an upper line, that's the air temperature through the night. You can see it starts off pretty high at 6 p.m. and then reaches its lowest value here, in this case about 3 degrees Celsius here by 6 a.m. Now the solid black line, that's the temperature of the ground surface. Okay? And notice how much colder that ground surface is than the air temperature. And that's a key thing to keep in mind, that any object which is in a field or anywhere else that's exposed to outer space, it loses heat through this black body radiation to outer space, and these objects become colder than the air, and they are actually often what are making the air itself cold, because the air is in contact or close to these objects. So the ground surface is quite a bit colder than the air temperature, and then what I have plotted in between on that green line, that's the air temperature of the leaves of the grapevine. So you can see the leaves themselves are quite a bit colder than the air temperature, not quite as cold as the ground surface. That's something we often don't take into consideration when we're trying to measure temperature conditions. We measure the air temperature, but that may not reflect accurately what the plants themselves are experiencing at a site. So just something to keep in mind. Now this kind of radiation loss of objects, we often see it, maybe not realize it. So this is a brutal winter in San Luis Obispo, where we got down to about 35 degrees on this morning. So we didn't get down to freezing, but yet we saw ice. And it was such a rare occurrence, I had to take a picture of it on a car here. But now, why would we get ice forming on a windshield when the air temperature isn't even down to freezing? Well, it's because of this sort of black body radiation from these objects which are exposed. So the air temperature of this car was quite a bit colder than 32 degrees. That's what caused the ice to form. So it's that radiation heat loss which is occurring all the time. That's what we're trying to guard against with our passive frost measures. And just again, it kind of reiterates the point that we can have temperatures in our vineyards which are much colder than what we're measuring with our air temperature. And so it's important to be aware of that. The other characteristic that we need to keep in mind for passive frost protection is that air flows. Cold air is more dense than warm air. So as we get cold air forming on these slopes here, it wants to slowly, very slowly flow downhill just due to gravity. I think that's called a katabatic wind. That's not really much of a wind. It's a very, very slow movement, kind of like molasses just flowing downhill. But then it accumulates in these low areas, which is where we see then the effect of that cold temperature. So with our what we call radiation frosts, where there really is otherwise no wind associated with it, we often see this type of pattern, that the coldest temperatures in the lowest areas like this. So the ancients, the folks that Glenn was talking about before, they understood this. And if you go even to places like Spain, where this picture was taken today, they still respect that pattern. They put grapevines up on these hills, and then in these lower frost-prone areas, they plant things like wheat that aren't going to be damaged by the cold temperatures. So they figured that out a long time ago, that to avoid loss of grapes, that they would try to respect this pattern. You get the air drainage happening from these hillsides, and if cold air accumulates in these lower areas, it's no big concern because it's not going to affect what they're growing there. You know, we here in the U.S., with our maybe lack of historical perspective, and we don't connect with the Romans much anymore, this is kind of what we end up doing. Now we're planting vineyards in frost pockets like this. So this is a vineyard planted in the lowest portion of the landscape. It's got where I'm standing up on a hill going up behind me, and then it's got higher ground up behind on the other side. So this is where the cold air is going to accumulate. And you know this is every year is going to be a very frost-prone site. So one can avoid a lot of frost protection hassles by simply choosing to plant vineyards in areas that are not going to experience this. Choosing to plant on higher ground if possible, and really trying to avoid these very, very low spots. Prior to being grapes, this probably did have alfalfa or grass, pasture, or some other irrigated forage crop, which would never have been affected by cold in the way that grapes are going to be. So it's going to be a challenge for them for sure. This is a really good example of trying to enhance the air drainage by having a vineyard on a steep enough slope. There's very little that's going to block the free movement of air through this vineyard and then out of it. So you're not going to have cold air accumulating at a site like this. So I would never really expect, under most of our radiation frost conditions, that this would be a concern. The only time when we'd expect damage here is when we have, which for us are usually more rare frosts, what we call advective freezes. Those are frosts associated with lots of wind bringing in a cold air mass, and there's not as much as that we can do to protect against those. Those are luckily more rare for us. But in our typical frosts, this type of situation is going to offer very, very good protection if you have this type of land available. Of course, this has other downsides of trying to farm on steep hillsides. Even though you might not be frosted, you might be washed out. So you have to balance all these factors.
Can you use the irrigation line, opening the water to raise up a bit?
Yeah, I don't really cover in that way directly, but, let's say you have like a drip irrigation line and you want to run your drip irrigation to create a little more heat. You do add a small amount of heat, maybe about half a degree of heating, because you're adding water which is a little bit warmer than the outside temperature. So you can gain something by running the drip irrigation. Not a lot, though. But it can be a practice. To look back at the air drainage issue, that we have to be cognizant that there can be barriers that prevent the movement of air. Sometimes we create them ourselves. So this is a big, like a windrow, I think of dairy compost or something here, or finished compost, that was put down on the lower edge of this vineyard block. It may not look like it, but this vineyard has a slope of about 4%. So having a blockage of the potential airflow could create problems with the escaping of cold air out of the vineyard. Maybe they were counting on the continued decomposition, creating heat from this pile to counteract that. I don't know. But that has since been removed. But that would be, to me, a really good example of the potential type of blockage that we could have. Other typical blockages could be hedge rows, rows of trees, fences that have a very dense slatting on them. Anything that impedes the movement of air through that will cause air to back up and create potential for more frost risk in those lower areas. Cover crops are a critical tool in our vineyards, but they do create different conditions with respect to the temperatures and frosts. This is an example of a cover crop that was never managed. This was a vineyard that was going between management companies, so it had a period when it wasn't being farmed by anybody, so the cover crop just sort of took off. And it created a great opportunity to see how damaging that would be during the frost period. So there's two things going on here. So remember, for passive frost, one of our goals is to try to capture as much of that incoming warmth during the daytime. If you have a thick cover crop like this, that's an insulating layer. There's not much sunlight going up to heat the ground surface to store for the following night. The other factor is, remember, objects radiate heat to outer space, and those objects become then very cold. Well, the surface of this cover crop is very cold. And it was raised up very high because it grew, so now you have this very cold surface right up near the sensitive tissues here of the grapevines. It basically brought the cold air up to where the vines are. So it's sort of a double whammy of not allowing much heat storage and raising the cold temperatures up higher to where the vine tissues are to really cause this damage. And this was in June that this happened. This vineyard was frosted 3 times because I drove by it checking on it. So that's a clear example of how sort of letting a cover crop do its own wild thing can lead to problems with frost. We really do need to manage cover crops. On the opposite extreme is clean tillage, where you go through, prior to bud break, disc down any cover crop that you had, maybe till the soil with the ideal of creating a fairly firm soil, which also has some moisture in it to maximize now both the heat storage and heat conduction into that soil, and which is then bare, so you don't have any shading or any insulation from a cover crop. So this type of condition here maximizes the storage of heat during the day and then the radiation of that heat at night. This is a really good tool to help prevent frost damage. But again, this type of management, if we had a late spring gully washer, runs a risk of having damage from that. So there's all these things to balance out here. So what people often do is sort of compromise. So here's a vineyard which had a nearly full coverage of cover crop, but then around bud break or prior to that, they came in and mowed it, and then this is the system that they end up with. So it's a compromise. You have some protection of the soil from heavy rainfall, but yet you don't have so much of a cover crop vegetation layer that you are allowing some heat to hit the soil and warm the soil, and you have kept the height low to not be raising up the cold temperatures up to where the vine tissues are. That usually is a fairly acceptable condition for many people. This is another compromise from a person who likes to live with great difficulty, I think. Because what they're mixing here, of course, they have bare soil and strips that they allow to have cover crop. What's unique here is that how they decided to have a bare strip here and then a cover crop strip there. It makes for a very pretty vineyard, but basically the idea is here they are trying to hedge their bets a little bit. They have the benefits of the bare soil by tilling every other row fully, so you get the warming benefit of that. But they also have the benefit of having a cover crop on every other row, or at least a short cover crop which they've mowed to try to have the soil protection benefits of that cover crop. So they're hedging their bets in case they do get a heavy rain, but yet they still have the warming benefits of having the bare soil. And I think the reason why they do this is because the way this vineyard is situated down in a low area, the highway is up above it. So as you drive by, you get to see it. So I think this is a very impressive farming, like a postcard or something of how one can make farming beautiful, this checkerboard pattern. Okay, so soil, the moisture content of the soil has an impact on the temperature. Remember, if there is some moisture in that soil, it increases the heat capacity and its ability to store heat to then release it later to heat the air at night. This is a really interesting example from a vineyard that had been irrigated prior to a very severe frost event, and that was this area up here that was irrigated before, and then the frost happened, and this area that had not been irrigated then was the part that suffered the damage. So the only difference is the soil moisture content of the site, where you had more moisture in the soil, no frost, where you had a drier soil, much more frost. And they were now irrigating the morning of the frost with a surface irrigation system here. So really clear impact. You can have a bare soil, but if that soil is very dry or if it's been tilled and it's very fluffy, you don't have as much of the benefit of being able to store the energy, because now that fluffy, dry soil is sort of an insulating layer itself and doesn't allow heat to be conducted up and down from deeper in that soil to outside. So that's something to keep in mind. And then another factor is, when we often measure air temperature, we're measuring typically at about 5 or 6 feet above the ground. But as I showed you in a previous slide here, that temperatures vary with height above the ground. And this is an example of some measurements measuring every foot above the ground from 1 foot up to 8 feet. And we're looking at how those temperatures vary on a single night, or actually 2 nights here. So on the far left, what we have is the nighttime temperatures, and then those temperatures go up and reach their peaks during the daytime, the high part of that chart, and they'll go down again for the following night. But look how much those temperatures are stratified during the night. The lowest bar, that's the temperature at 1 foot above the ground, and then the highest bar up here, this sort of dashed blue line, that's the temperature up at 8 feet. That's a huge range in temperature over really what's a fairly small difference in height above the ground. So this is something we can't feel when we go out to a site. We can't feel this difference in temperature with our hands, but with sensitive measurement techniques like this, we can actually then quantify what that difference is. So if our goal is to avoid cold conditions, maybe you can see how at sites like this, placing the vine higher up off the ground, or those sensitive tissues, would be a great avoidance mechanism to keep it out of that cold air. And then this goes back to that question of, well, why might somebody decide to have a vine which is trained very close to the ground? Well, if we're in a site that has that type of air stratification, and you decide to plant this elvish vineyard here that really can only be farmed by somebody who's 1.5 feet tall because they'll fit, you are basically putting those plants into an environment where they are going to freeze, be more likely to suffer cold damage. Whereas, like this gentleman, this is in Argentina, where there are these traditional systems which were probably imported by the Italian immigrants to Argentina 500 years ago, whatever, who grow wine grapes on overhead trellises like this. They now put those sensitive tissues high up off the ground. So that would impart a substantial amount of frost avoidance by making that choice. So this site here, the reason why they chose that was because they're in a very cold area. They need to have the heat to help that fruit ripen. But the consequence of that, planting very close to the ground, is that now they have to have sprinkler frost protection, because otherwise these vines would freeze every year because of that. This works in Argentina. It's a good fit for that environment. This is a kind of a problem because it requires extra inputs to prevent those vines from freezing. Another method that maybe we could call passive, because we're sort of doing it well in advance of any freezing, would be delayed pruning. The advantage here, if you prune late, you're allowing those canes from the previous year, those buds, to start developing. And when you have far more buds on a vine, it pushes the bud development date back. Bud break date is further delayed because of that. So you gain some time by doing that. Now the trick is, though, if you decide to prune late, you have to be able to get in there after this happens and prune off fairly quickly before these shoots start developing very much. Because if you have unpruned vines like this and you allow all these individual shoots to grow, that growth is being used, is financed by use of storage carbohydrates. So you don't want to burn up all that vine's carbohydrates, producing a bunch of tissues, which then you cut off in a couple of weeks. So there is a bit of a time period here when you can actually let this happen before you have to come in and prune these vines back. And there's a lot of people who don't have enough labor to get in to do all of this pruning at once on large acreages. So typically this would be done at problem sites where you don't have any other means of adequately controlling for frost. But it can work quite well. At cutting, at pruning? Well, the shock, not from removing it. The shock would be you have sensitive tissues which could be easily damaged, say if you're sloppy and pulling off canes. So that would be a risk right there. The shock would be if you allowed all those individual tiny shoots to continue growing up until they're, say, a foot long, and then try to cut it all off. You've exhausted the vine to a great degree by doing that. So now, variety and rootstock selection. This is another choice that we have, another passive measure to try to design a vineyard which is going to be less prone to having frost damage to begin with. We can choose for early bud break varieties like Pinot Noir or Chardonnay, or rootstocks like 10114 tend to have earlier bud break than, say, other combinations like Cabernet Sauvignon or SO4 rootstock. So we within our ability sometimes to choose what is planted where, oftentimes there's other factors like the market as far as what determines what you're planting, but if you do have the ability to put more frost-prone varieties in areas where they're not going to have an early bud break, that might be a way to avoid problems. Or your varieties which have an early bud break, put them in areas where to be less prone to that early frost. You simply can gain several weeks of frost-free growth that way by putting them in other areas. Okay, so now active frost protection. These are those practices which you're actually doing in the moment, trying to stop the frost through the night as it's happening. Our main practice in California has always been sprinkler frost protection in many areas where water is available to do so. It can work very, very well, but as you may be able to see from the picture here, it requires lots of water. And that is the one thing that in many areas we no longer have in abundance to be able to use this practice. So there's a lot of pressure in a lot of farming areas for a variety of reasons, but all related to water scarcity, to find alternatives to this. But it still does work well and is going to be the main tool in areas where it is most suitable. So what happens when you put this water on in the night, that the freezing of the water releases heat. That's called the heat of fusion. And as long as that water-ice mixture is encasing the vine tissue, and there's continually more water being applied, which is always freezing, whatever is encased in that ice tissue never drops below 32 degrees. So you always need to have more and more water being applied and constant freezing for that to occur. Requires a fair amount of water, 50 to 75 gallons per minute per acre, depending on what level of protection you're trying to achieve. That's a substantial amount of water. That's the amount of water that's being applied with a standard impact sprinkler type system. It's putting water over the entire area, even though really what you're trying to protect is a fairly narrow strip of vines. Constant application is key. If any time during the night that system stops, you end up creating a far worse problem than if you hadn't put those sprinklers on in the first place. Because then you start getting enhanced evaporation from a very wet surface, which will cause temperatures to drop even lower. So you have to have a very reliable, well-maintained system if you're going to use that. And always keep in mind is that water, when it freezes, it releases heat, but when water evaporates, that basically cools the system. And a certain volume of water that evaporates cools far more than that same volume of water freezing. So you have to freeze far more water than evaporates. So evaporation of water during sprinkler frost protection is your enemy. So that's why when you turn the system on, you need to start it well before you are down to freezing temperatures, because you have evaporation occurring right away, which then lowers the temperature of the whole system. And when you turn it off, you have to wait until after the freezing period has passed so that you don't get a dip of temperature due to that evaporation that happens when you turn it off. If you are running sprinklers and the wind picks up, that can create big problems because wind will increase the evaporation rate and create more cooling. So that is often the big risk with running sprinklers. There is another type of sprinkler we call targeted sprinklers that put the water directly over the vine row. And the advantage is then you reduce your water use quite a bit. They might use about 1/3 the amount of water as the standard sprinklers that put it out over the entire system. And they can be close to equally effective as our standard sprinklers. The problem is they require more maintenance, because you have to make sure those little systems, they have a lot of sprinklers in the vineyard. You have to make sure they're all aimed right. Otherwise, if they're off a little bit, you don't have protection. And they can be more impacted by wind because the wind will then move the water off of where it's supposed to land. So there are some risks with using those systems, but where they work well, they can be very effective. But yeah, they can fail. This is an example of a vineyard that sprinklers were turned on, they were working well, the wind picked up, and then we had actually more damage occur than if we had not had the sprinklers on in the first place. So just a really clear example that wind and sprinklers are not a good combination. Okay, that sounds ironic, though, that wind machines, creating wind, is another one of our active measures. So, of course, we don't have water associated with using wind machines. So wind machines operate on a very different physical method here. We're mixing the warmer air, which often occurs higher above the ground, with the colder air, which occurs near the ground. That is called a temperature inversion when you have much warmer air higher above the ground. Let's say we're measuring that maybe at 30, 35 feet, pretty high off the ground. And mixing of that air with the lower air is what creates that warming effect. They're fairly expensive machines, though. You're looking at $30,000, $35,000 roughly per machine. And each machine might cover about 10 acres. So if you do the math, that's a lot of upfront investment that one has to make to put in that type of frost protection. Because of the whole water scarcity issue, we're seeing a lot more interest in wind machines. I've been spending quite a bit of time in Sonoma County in the last few years. During the drought, they all popped up like daffodils everywhere. Wind machines everywhere. It was amazing how many were being installed here because they really fit well in conditions where people did not have access to the water they had before for frost protection. If there's a downside, it's the noise issue. They can be quite loud, and neighbors, if there's something they'll complain about, it's the helicopter sound that comes from that if they live near to where that wind machine is. So there's some ways to maybe address that as well. There is one use of wind machines that we could make use of more in California is for preventing winter freeze damage. So this is not frost protection in the spring or fall, but rather during the middle of winter, if you're in an area where you're concerned about the early winter cold temperatures, let's say it's getting down to 14 degrees or something, if you have an inversion, you can run a wind machine to help warm up those conditions and prevent winter freeze damage. That's often done in places like Ontario, where colder parts where they're growing grapes, they use the wind machines to help prevent that winter cold damage. The noise issue, there's maybe some solutions that could be coming to us from elsewhere. So on the picture on the left, that's the standard type of wind machine blade used in California and elsewhere in the U.S. Two-bladed, large diameter propeller. Very effective, but very noisy because of that large diameter and the shape of those tips. There's a company in New Zealand that's now producing multi-bladed propellers which have a smaller diameter, but with multiple blades they're designed to turn at a lower speed. And that lower speed creates less noise. So these 4 and 5 bladed propellers reportedly will create less noise. I have yet to see them here in the U.S. I've heard there's some maybe in Canada yet, but once we get some in California, it'd be fun to test them and just see, is there much of a noise difference, and if so, how much? And I would expect them to maybe not perform quite as well as a standard 2-bladed propeller, which could be the hesitation for having used them so far, but that trade-off of slightly less performance but gaining a noise advantage might make it worthwhile to explore these here in the U.S. as well, especially as we get more and more wind machines being installed in next to areas with people. But to answer the question of whether or not a wind machine would provide a useful benefit at a site, the measurement to determine that is actually fairly simple. It's just measuring the air temperature at 5 feet above the ground and 35 feet or some other high height above the ground, like in this example here. So a fairly simple thing, but we've known about this relationship for a long time. Under these conditions, if you operate a wind machine, the resulting air temperature in your field is going to be about the average of these two temperatures. So in this example, it looks like the temperature difference is about 4 degrees. So we would gain about 2 degrees Fahrenheit in warming by turning on a wind machine and running it by mixing the air here. So that's a fairly simple way to then estimate what the potential benefit of operating a wind machine is at a site like this. And the way we do that, we put out basically normal weather stations, but they simply have a tall tower with them and put a temperature sensor up high at 35 feet. So that simple addition then allows us to measure the temperature inversion on frost nights and determine whether or not we have conditions where wind machines would be useful tools. So I've been doing work with Glenn McGourty and another colleague, Rhonda Smith, in the North Coast here, putting out a network of 17 of these stations to do just that, to try to understand, do we have the types of conditions that would lead to reliable use of wind machines. And the hope is that if we do show that, then that would provide that little bit of encouragement for farmers who are using sprinkler frost protection to be able to shift over to wind machines if we can demonstrate that that's a useful tool. But if we can demonstrate that it's not as reliable in an area, then that's good to know. Be a very good reason to stick with sprinkler frost protection or find some other method where it be most suitable. So this is an example of the type of assessment you can do at a site to understand the inversion conditions. So in this example, I was using portable towers, which if we can go to the field tomorrow, I will show you. Otherwise, if we have a presentation tomorrow, I'll show you slides of how that works. But there's a very inexpensive way to take these inversion measurements at a site at a very high density. So in this example, this is about a 100-acre site that has yet to be planted. I put out 11 of these towers in a grid, basically, to measure what the inversion conditions were like. And this is something you want to do before you plant a vineyard. Once you put blocks in the ground and you start frost protecting them, your ability to do this is greatly reduced. So it's much easier to do this before you plant, do this for 1 or 2 seasons to really develop that information to then inform you of what type of frost protection system you might find suitable for that site. So it's a very simple way to do this. The cost of doing this was less than $1,000 in materials, so really pretty inexpensive to be able to pull that off. And ultimately, what we're trying to do with this type of information is to allow you or other farmers to have the type of information you need to know whether or not an investment of about $300,000, which you're looking at right here, whether or not that makes sense. Again, these are expensive devices. You want to make sure that if you're going to spend the money on them, that you get a known return from operating them, and that you're not going to be putting your crop at risk by making this choice. So that's our ultimate goal. Now, there are some alternative type wind machines out there. It's not a very good picture. The one on the left, that's a tow and blow machine from New Zealand. It's on like a cherry picker boom. It can be raised up and lowered, and it has a smaller engine on it, I think about a 25 horsepower engine as compared to typically 100 horsepower or more for a conventional wind machine. But it's much quieter and probably impacts a smaller area because of it has much less power. But if it does have an interesting feature that's portable, but also it can be set up to oscillate. So our normal wind machines turn in a full circle, 360 degrees, so you put them in the center of the area you're trying to protect. This type of oscillating machine, you might be able to put it on the edge of a field and try to affect a smaller area. So it may have some advantages for areas like that. The image on the right, that's a vertically blowing wind machine that is more designed to drain cold air out of areas. And we've done some research with those. In our trials, they haven't been as effective as a conventional type wind machine, but there may be areas where those do work well. So part of the challenge of looking at frost protection is that every site is unique as far as its topography and how air moves and cold air accumulates. So it's really hard sometimes to take information from one area and apply it to your exact field, which is why I've always been a proponent of trying to encourage people to measure at your own site to really understand what is happening there, especially for frost conditions. You might have a field which is far more prone to frost than your neighbor because of simple differences in altitude or topography or aspect, and it's really good for you to understand that and not necessarily just look at your neighbors to make a prediction of what might be happening at your area. Yeah.
Is that one on the right, is it sucking air down, out, or is it going?
It's pushing air up. Yep. And I should mention that also has a smaller horsepower engine. I think that particular one has about an 8 horsepower engine. So compared to our conventional type wind machines, much smaller in their power requirements, and they'd be quieter in operation too as a consequence of that. So we just have to verify whether or not they're as effective as our standard conventional type wind machine. Another tool that we don't use as much anymore in California as we used to a lot are these fuel heaters and other types of heaters. They can be very effective, but you need large numbers of them in the field in order for them to provide good protection. And with labor constraints, to have to go out and light these things and maintain them and add fuel, that has been a big limitation anymore in California. And especially when fuel is more expensive, these become far less attractive. The other issue is air pollution concerns. The older models especially were notorious for producing some pretty bad air pollution. The diesel fuel that we use for them, pretty nasty stuff. This type of a heater is called a return stack heater. It does produce a little bit of a cleaner burn, and it is the type that you're typically required to use anymore if you are going to use heaters in many of our areas. But still, every day we see less and less of these just because of the challenge and the labor required to do them. I know in other parts of the world they still use a lot of burning materials to create warmth. And I have a slide here from, this is not another part of the world, this is Washington State, where somebody was putting out these barrels full of old lumber. This is not like a free pile. This is what they're going to burn on a frost night to protect this orchard from frost damage. So it still can occur. If you're out in the rural areas, you can get away with things that you'd have a hard time doing if you're in more urbanized parts of our world here. But, again, it can provide a benefit. The trick to making something like this work is that you don't want to have your heat source to be too hot. A single hot source just creates a heat chimney, which then sends all that hot air way up beyond what we call your temperature ceiling, the point at which that would try to trap that heat. You want to have a larger number of devices, well distributed, each one a little bit cooler, just a little bit above the heat of your surrounding area, to then gently raise the heat over a larger area and then kind of trap that heat under the inversion ceiling. That's the ideal way for this to work. But again, we're going away from this for good reasons. Spray materials, there's other ways that we can try to address frost damage. Copper sprays to reduce the ice nucleating bacteria. Glenn McGroarty over here, he has been sort of the queen of copper for the last several years. If you put him under a black light, he glows sort of bluish-green color because he's been doing all sorts of spray trials, trying to quantify the benefits of copper sprays in the springtime to reduce the ice nucleating bacteria. So in order for a frost to form on tissue, you need some kind of nucleator to initiate that freezing ice process, ice formation. And one of the most effective nucleators are bodies of bacteria. Those bacteria then initiate the ice. So when the temperature of tissue drops below freezing, that little bacteria initiates the formation of an ice crystal, which then causes the damage throughout the plant tissue. So if you can get rid of those ice nucleators by spraying copper on the vine tissues well before frost, that could be a strategy to help reduce frost damage. But grapevines naturally don't have high levels of these ice nucleating bacteria as maybe some other plants like our cover crops do. Correct me if I'm wrong, Glenn, but one of the main findings so far of your work is that a key thing is to manage our cover crops, keeping them from being key factors like in that slide where I showed you where the cover crops are up at the same height as our vine tissue. Early mowing, keeping the cover crop levels down to reduce the content of ice nucleating bacteria, which is really coming from those cover crops most likely, and less so on our vines.
Mowing is the best, actually. So
Yeah.
it does counter the other thing about trying to make healthier soils with cover crops. If it's bare soil with all the vegetation gone, that's going to be the least frost prone.
Yep, yep. One of life's compromises here. So there are some other spray materials, some nutrients, potassium products, which are marketed as improving the hardness of vines, anti-transpirants, which can be applied, which may provide some benefit. The problem with a lot of these is that the research results are highly variable, may not be well supported by independent research, or even just how they behave one year to the next might not be very consistent. So there's a reason why we're probably not using these as widespread primary frost protection practices, but maybe there's some room for them to provide some benefit in your program. But if you do have to spray something on every 5 days in anticipation of a frost, that's a big cost out there. If you're already spraying something else, then there might be more of a window to be applying something. So that's, again, these spray materials, it may not be the thing to bet the farm on, but it's important to keep them in mind that there might be some other products. So one question that we get is if we do have a frost, let's say that causes limited damage, an example like this, where it burned off portions of the shoots but left the clusters intact, what should we do? Should we just leave it and let the vine grow out, or should we go through manually, pull off all the shoots to then force the vine to grow again as if it got fully frosted? And this is another question. If you have portions of the vineyard that got heavily frosted and other portions lightly frosted, how should you approach that? And unfortunately, there is no one single answer. This whole approach of doing a manual shoot breakout where you send a crew in, they actually break off all the shoots, even the healthy ones, to duplicate what a thorough frost should have done, to go through there and bring all the vines back to a uniform starting level. That is one approach, and there's been some research which has shown that that does provide a benefit of more uniform production and can help uncomplicate pruning later by not having this sort of jungle which can form from these semi-frosted shoots. But the research hasn't been consistent that that's always beneficial. So I'm not sure if there's ever going to be a solid answer to what you should do if you've had this partial frost occurring at a site. So we should almost either pray for no frost or a thorough frost, because that would in some ways almost be the best outcome. These partial frosts really create a complicated problem for people to solve sometimes. Okay, and my last slide here, just weather information. When you're dealing with frost, it's really important to have information from your site because your site is unique and you need to know what's going on there. So in-field sensors, our traditional sensor was your standard bulb thermometer, often installed in your coldest spot in the vineyard, that you would then drive by and look at that thermometer and you get a feel for what your temperature conditions are. That's cheap, reliable, there's no batteries involved. We still make use of those things even in our modern times. They serve their purpose. The next step up would be to install a decent quality thermometer in your vehicle. It's probably not the one that came with it, even though you might be able to use that. A lot of our cars now tell us what the temperature is outside. There's other sensors you can then wire through your dash to then have a temperature sensor up on the front bumper or something to give you a more precise measure of the temperature as you're driving through the field at 2 a.m., at least in the comfort of your car or truck while you're doing that. There are other interesting devices. There are flashing light indicators. So these are fixed devices that you put out in the field. And the beauty of them is that when the temperature drops to a first set threshold, let's say 34 degrees, they start flashing, let's say, yellow. And then when they drop to 32 degrees, they start flashing red. That way you can tell from afar what is going on in your field. And if you're hiring somebody to fly in a helicopter over your field, they can see where the cold temperatures are. So that's really a pretty darn cost-effective approach to communicating information to you from afar of what the temperature conditions are. And they're fairly inexpensive devices to put out. Your own weather station, if you have key areas where you need to have weather data on, or now these networks of weather sensors are becoming more cost-effective. You can have mesh networks of small devices that all talk to each other, and on your smartphone you can see a map of what your current conditions are at a fairly reasonable cost anymore. If you had very serious frost concerns, that might be a worthwhile investment. If it's something that's going to occur very rarely, that might be hard to justify that type of expense. So your own needs will help direct where your efforts should go. Okay, I think I'm good. All right, any questions, comments? Sure. So yeah, experimentation with heated wires. Yeah, there's people have experimented with a variety of things. I have not heard the results of that. If electricity is cheap and you can train your workers not to touch the wire, that might work. People have looked at using microwaves to heat areas. There's a wide range of things we have experimented with, trying to piping natural gas to burners throughout a vineyard to help heat it that way. There's lots of possibilities.
Using sprinklers for irrigation, does it make a difference if it's pumping out of a reservoir versus pumping out of underground?
So sprinklers for frost protection like this? Yeah, well, typically most of our wells, the limitation on using a well directly for frost protection, it doesn't have the flow rate necessary to provide sprinklers to your entire field you need covered. So oftentimes that requires you to build a reservoir, fill that reservoir gradually over time from your well, and then you have a separate set of pumps, larger pumps taking out of that reservoir to be able to have the flow rate necessary to cover your entire field. So oftentimes sprinkler frost protection requires a large infrastructure of reservoirs and larger diameter pipes to make that whole system work. And that's part of the stumbling block anymore to putting these systems in many areas. You need to get a permit for that large reservoir, and you need to make sure neighbors are not unhappy with you taking all that water to do that. No. An oil application? No, we commonly apply our horticultural oils pretty early in the spring, and that might have some of the effects of some of these anti-transpirants to maybe provide some benefit in that regard. No, we typically use oil sprays for our early applications, so I think as long as you're not exceeding rates, I see more damage by people putting on excessive rates of product. Yeah.
We looked at that in Mendocino County, comparing that to copper, and we looked at copper and oil, and the oil didn't really change much. It was really the copper that made the difference.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, a good comment. Yeah, one more. 35 feet. Yeah, and that's kind of the sweet spot. We can get up to 35 feet cheaply. Anything beyond that, it costs you a lot more money to get up higher. Concrete, all those things, which I don't want to mess with.